Please welcome our next panel on technology. What's the role of technology? I think very large is the answer, and we hope for some more detail from our panel, which is made up of Gordon Conway, who we've met before from Imperial, Frank Reiberman, am I pronouncing you right? Very good, from CGIAR, Jeff Simmons from Elanco, and Mark Linus, who's an author and environmental campaigner. Gordon, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you Gordon Conway's 5 minutes on sustainable intensification. I'm going to use PowerPoints because it'll wake me up, and maybe it'll wake you up too. Can I have the first slide, please? Right. When we think about food security, there are three really key elements. One, of course, is resources, one is access, and one is productivity. And all three of those are important. One needs to say that right from the beginning. Of course, with productivity, that's what we're going to focus on, and we're going to focus on technology. So I don't think any of us up here, or any of you in the room, think that technology is the only answer. But it is an important ingredient. Now, just to recap what I said, I don't know when it was, long time ago this morning. I said we've got to intensify, we have to produce more of food and nutritious foods and agricultural products and incomes for farmers, and we have to do it on the same amount or less of land and water. We have to do it more with less. But we have to do it sustainably. Just this slide is relatively easy. We all know how to do that. But we have to do it sustainably. And that means prudent use of inputs. It means reducing the emissions of CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide. It means increasing natural capital, for example, soil, biota, and enemies of pests and so on, reducing the environmental impact, and strengthening resilience. And as I said earlier, this is a tall order. We've never had to do this really so focused and concentrated before. And let me give some examples. The point I want to make here is this applies to all of us. It applies to us in the developed countries, people in the emerging countries, and people in the developing countries. The principles are the same, even if the practices are different. So, for example, we need to target fertilizers better. Precision farming in the developed countries means that you use GPS systems, you use maps of your farm, and you apply fertilizer as you drive around the farm with your tractor. It says, put some fertilizer here, it says, don't bother here, and so on. You target the fertilizer. And it's the same in Africa. Precision farming here means putting your fertilizer in the cap of a Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, or whatever other cola you like, into a hole in the ground where you plant the maize seed. So you get away with only 11 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So in both cases, you're getting high yields, but you're using exactly the right amount of fertilizer that you need to get those. It makes it cheaper. It means you've got less pollution from runoff from nitrate, and it means you've got less emissions of nitrous oxide. The principle is the same, the practices are different. And we would argue, and by the way, outside there are, can you give me a copy of that so I can wave it at people? Sorry, very good, thank you. Outside on the table there are the two Montpellier panel reports, one on sustainable intensification, one on innovation for sustainable intensification. So I do suggest you pick them up if you want to see more about what I was saying. We would argue that there are three approaches to sustainable intensification. One is ecological, sustainable ecological intensification. One is genetic, sustainable genetic intensification, and the other is socioeconomic, sustainable socioeconomic intensification. And I can spend hours on all of these, but just some quick examples. Ecological intensification, a good example here is a leguminous tree called Phytherbia in Africa, which has the extraordinary habit of shedding its leaves in the wet season, right? Rains come down, it drops all its leaves. You put maize underneath it, and the maize will produce you about 3 tons per hectare from the nitrogen that's coming down, that has come down, as it were, from the leaves. And in addition, you're getting carbon sequestered in the soil from the falling leaves. You're also getting carbon in the standing crop of trees, up to 30 tons of carbon per hectare in a standing crop of a mature row of trees like that. So you're getting all these benefits that you want. Genetic intensification means putting more beneficial traits in individual crop plants. And you can do this in all kinds of different ways. This is just one example of a nutritious crop, orange flesh sweet potato, where this wonderful woman called Maria Andrade, who's over there, who took orange flesh sweet potatoes from the United States, crossed them in Mozambique with white flesh sweet potatoes. She's now got yellow flesh sweet potatoes, which are rich in vitamin A. She has got a new breeding system which gets a new variety every 4 years. And she's a remarkable woman because she's not only a good agronomist, she's a very good disseminator of her materials. She's got a lot of way of getting the sweet potatoes out to farmers through a whole system of distribution. And as you can see, she's a great publicist. When she turned up at the hotel, she was in an orange Land Rover, dressed in an orange dress, and she made me put on an orange T-shirt. There's very few agronomists in the world who can do all those 3 things. And it's one of those essences there. Now, of course, this is using modern, usually marker-aided selection. But we will also need, for a number of reasons, biotechnology into the future, genetically modified crops into the future, particularly to deal with the terrible pests and diseases that afflict us in Africa. And Mark is going to talk about some of those. And then thirdly, most of the socio-economic intensification is about intensifying relationships between farmers and between farmers and markets. What you're looking for in this case is to find farmer associations, co-ops or whatever it is, that really do give the farmers much greater power to bargain for better prices for their products. It also means they can reduce the waste because they've got them in a little warehouse here, and they can treat them in that way. But the big question is, what particular farmer associations are sustainable in what particular culture and in what particular place? So you've got those 3, ecological approaches, genetic approaches, socio-economic approaches, and they need to be resilient. There's another paper out there on resilience. The essence, of course, here is that you recover from stress or shock. And what is interesting about innovation here is that you're looking for multiple benefits, not just for higher yields. You're looking at all these different benefits. And that means nearly automatically you have to have multiple partners. No one institution can do this. You're going to have combinations of partners. You're also going to have to use multiple approaches like ecological, genetic, socio-economic, and use them in combination. And you're going to have to work at multiple scales. You're talking about sustainable intensification at the farm level, at the district level, at the level of, level of the landscape. And the final point I want to make is, and this I think is a question for all of us on the panel, who should be responsible for all of this? We know that the private sector spends 11 times as much as the public sector on agricultural research. And we know that the private sector is very good at innovation, but often the innovation is not geared towards some of the key crops that smallholders need, particularly in Africa. And it doesn't necessarily produce these multiple benefits. But what is it? What are we aiming for here? Who's going to do what? Who around this table, because we've got, no, it's not a table, but who around this bench, where we've got the private sector, we've got public sector, who's responsible for what in terms of sustainable intensification? Thank you.
Thanks. You want to go next?
That's very interesting because Gordon, as I suspected he would, showed some of the slides I was told I shouldn't. So that is, you know, he gave you some of the examples I wanted to talk about. Makes my speech a little bit shorter and I can respond to some of his points. I think I share his optimism about technology. And in a way, it's a very exciting time to be an agricultural scientist, and that's something strange. It's not that long ago where all the bright young minds wanted to go into IT because agriculture was boring, sleepy. But you know, some of the core technologies, the cost of sequencing, are falling so rapidly, faster than Moore's law, that it's a very dynamic sector. All kinds of technologies that were far out of reach or that people were thinking of what they could one day have, 3, 4, 5 years later, are available and affordable and in even our labs. It is true that the private sector was way ahead of the game in a way, and you know, as it wasn't on the radar screens of the DFIDs, as it now is, as you heard earlier from Lynn Featherstone, we are catching up. So public research for smallholder farmers is catching up, particularly in these core areas of developing varieties, and you've heard a number of examples already today. So scuba rice that can be underwater for 2 weeks, or the drought-resistant corn that Hugh Grant also mentioned, where technology came from Monsanto and moved to the CGIAR and is moving into the field. The good thing is all these things are actually reaching millions of farmers today. It's not pilots at the thousands level, it's actually reaching millions of farmers today. And we are seeding a pipeline, if you like, with very exciting things. Things like C4 rice or wheat, where we're trying to change the fundamental architecture of the plants to improve the efficiency of their photosynthesis. That might still sound pie in the sky today, but that might be possible 10, 15 years from now and lead to very big changes. Or getting traits from wild relatives of some of our major cereals today, which some of our scientists describe as, you know, replaying evolution, or 1 million years of evolution in 10 years in the labs. So it's a very exciting time, and there will be all kinds of new technologies coming out of that. But are we getting it right? I think you've already heard many speakers today say that, yes, there are some successes with biofortification. You mentioned orange-fleshed sweet potatoes, or beans, or other varieties with higher zinc and iron and vitamin A content. That is going reasonably well. We have a goal funded again by DFID to reach 50 million farm families in the next few years, and the first 5 million have been reached. But we are quite aware that we probably got the overall priorities for these nutrition-rich, nutrition-dense, or what also Ndiwa Siwanda said this morning, the female crops, the ones that are grown by the women in their household yards and so on, we haven't got those right. We probably haven't invested enough in those crops. How do we bring that same science to those crops? How do we get those varieties out in the field? And likewise, I think livestock and forage and associated fish as well are probably underrepresented in our system. So we probably need to do a lot more, particularly in those areas, than we are doing today. But that's a challenge to you all, but to ourselves as well, to investors and to researchers. Then there are some very interesting technologies, and you showed, Gordon, the Phytoherbia tree, these fertilizer trees, which now are not just a practicality, but they're actually being planted, or actually, they're not planted, they can be regenerated. It turns out these seeds are in the soils in Africa, and the only thing farmers need to do is make sure the goats actually don't eat the seedlings to actually protect their regeneration. And in millions of hectares in desolate landscapes in Mali and Niger, we have these trees that are doubling corn yields through intercropping. And the Indian president just yesterday in the World Agroforestry Conference committed $1 billion to plant or regenerate hundreds of millions of those trees in India as well. And it shows us that sometimes very simple technologies, but in more complex ideas, in healthy landscapes. So it's not just the silver bullet of the improved varieties, it's healthy landscapes, getting back to Gordon's point of we really need sustainable intensification. So yes, technology, but in a much more complex context. Sustainable intensification. The challenge both of intensification in continents where we haven't really managed that so far, and sustainable in a way that we deal with climate change and resilience and so on. So yes, we are quite impressed with the potential of technology to contribute, but at the same time, the fact that, as the other slide you put up this morning, the perfect storm where all these problems come together, show us that silver bullets are very unlikely to reach the target. Almost everywhere do we see systems challenges, multidisciplinary challenges, and particularly the need to connect people like ourselves in research through the private sector that can actually turn varieties into seeds, provide advice to farmers, and then farmers to markets. So the whole idea of value chains around these crops is quite powerful and actually becoming more and more a core concept for a lot of the work that we do and that we do with partners, whether that's the private sector or the large-scale NGOs like World Vision that can be alternatives to reach farmers where there aren't markets at the moment. So with some context, we are quite positive about contributions technology can make, with some pretty serious limitations, because it turns out actually if you look at all these systems, at farming systems, and actually that yield gap, I think Hugh Grant this morning said, you know, best farmers in the US can get 400 bushels corn per acre, only 20 in Africa, so we already have the technology. Well, actually figuring out why there is a yield gap is one of the more complex things we need to figure out. So it might seem simple, but it's actually one of the more complex challenges we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yes. So let me share my perspective will be around the animal protein, meat, milk, and eggs, as well as I want to really just think about the next 10 years, because I believe the next 10 years, fastest growth of middle class in the history of man is going to happen in the next 10 years, and that's in most of our windows of our careers. And I think I look in our sector in meat, milk, and eggs, there's kind of three numbers that hit me. The 3 billion that are rapidly coming into the middle class, a lot of that's going to happen in the next 10 years. They're going to eat 60% more meat than we in milk and eggs. And the other number I think is important to keep in context is, and we've talked about it today, is 1.5. We're living on a planet and a half. World Wildlife Fund says on August 27th of this year, we'll cross the line of using the renewable resources that we're supposed to. So we've got a little room to do here with more with less. I will also say, though, I'm as positive as the speakers as I've ever been, as Hugh and others mentioned today. I sit around a table with a bunch of human pharmaceutical people that are chasing Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, and they don't have the cure. And they aren't sure exactly what the solution is. I think we all know here we have the cure. We've got a growing middle class. There is a positive ending to this story. It's a lot about collaboration. It's a lot about making sure that we operate, I think, with the right urgency. But to me, there is enough innovation, especially in this animal-based protein. I use an example. I always say if I can't explain it to my wife's book club that comes at night to our house and I can't, there's no probably protein that is more high dense and more quality and more longed for with someone moving off from rice and beans, the 1 out of 2 people right now that are moving into middle class, than getting an egg. 2 eggs a week can increase brain development, body development. We all know that. A recent study here in Kenya showed 48% improvement in test scores in the shortness of 1 year by 2 eggs per day. So I think it's back to better nutrition, not just calories. I think South London, a mother also, 2 eggs per week instead of a bag of crisps before the kid goes off to school not only helps brain development, but I think also handles the obesity and the nutrition aspects. But the other story, if you kind of turn the egg the other way, a little different than the plant story, is we have 6 billion hens laying 168 eggs per year. And we're actually going backwards. We're losing about an egg per year per hen. So not like the plant side, we're going backwards. And if we stay on this course, how we've actually protected ourselves is we're adding animals. And that's a little bit of the falsehood in our story in animal production, is we're adding animals, where ultimately our goal in animals should be a healthy animal. A healthy animal does more with less, optimal health, optimal welfare, better food safety. And the other one no one talks about is the real food waste in our business is 20% of all animals, global animals, get wasted before they actually get to food because of morbidity. So to me, that's our goal. And that's, I think, the real story on eggs. So innovation's the answer. Let me just highlight a few things on innovation on the animal side. Innovation's in 4 areas. I think practices is very important. I say the greatest way to impact India's dairy industry is fresh water. Genetics, no question, there's huge upside potential, maybe more so than even plants in animal genetics. You move to technologies as well as data. Data and turning data to knowledge is actually a better way to expand the margin than probably any product that we could develop. And we've got a lot of time and a lot of other companies in the data area. I think when you look at potential, comparing it to the plant discussion this morning, we see 100 to 400% on dairy, beef, pork, and even poultry, which is harder. Aquaculture is probably a little less potential. The average dairy cow in America is 7 gallons per cow per day. The top ones are 10 to 12. The global dairy cows, 2. Africa, 1/4 of a gallon per cow per day. So the potential is that 10 to 12-fold the same in animals. And I look at the pipeline today, because I know there's sensitivity here. I see the pipeline of everything from enzymes to phages for technology, genomics, vaccines, some pretty interesting things in the diagnostic area to be much more precision, where a vet can script things to an animal, not to a herd or to a flock. But I want to end with maybe a little bit of a provocative. I've never been more positive. I sat here today compared to a year ago saying we've seen more progress in enabling more animals, to produce more with less and be healthier than we were a year ago. So I see progress, but we need to make sure we're equipping an environment that is very prone to innovation. And that I think continues to be a concern. If we don't have a fact-based, rules-based, scientific-based, predictable regulatory or innovation-based environment, people aren't going to bring innovation. I know many innovations that are not being brought to certain parts of the world, or innovations that aren't even being brought to pipelines because of the concern of the acceptance. And I think that's the difference I see between human farm and animal health. Human farm is a pull for innovation, and for us it's a lot more of a pragmatic stage. So I want to get right to the heart. My last point is, I think the number one reason why we don't have the total accessibility, why we can change this ag statistic, is the consumer. Hasn't even been talked about much today. And I think the consumer is a sensitive area. And choice is important. I want to be very careful here to say, hey, I believe, and I think all of us in this room, the top consumer right ought to be choice. All of us believe that. But I also believe that when a false conclusion is based on what we think a consumer is believing, and we take food policy or food opportunities away, and there's more people hungry because of that, then I think that may be one of the greatest food injustices of our time. And I think we need to be careful of that in the next 10 years. Consumers don't want innovation, right? I asked for my one slide, and I would say not exactly. Let's be a little careful. The world has changed, so our consumer has changed. So I think we need to change a little bit. And if you can build out, there's 2 more here. So here's what I would just challenge us all. We used to be a world that read headlines. And I think we're less about headlines and a lot more about conversations. Today, I could have 2 clicks on my iPhone and tell you how many mentions and conversation in London about a technology in food. We need to know what the conversations are and not overreact if the conversation isn't there. If you could click the button 2 more times. The other is any survey that I look at in technology and food, or any policymaker or any retailer I ask, be careful that it's aided questions. If it's a yes and no, do you really want an animal that's been yes or no, versus what's important to you and you buy dairy products. And the last is a call inquiry line. We need to be a little careful that we're making food policy decisions or banning a technology when you really probably be looking at consumer data. So to me, if you said, what's the one blockage? It isn't that we don't have the pipelines. It isn't that we can't create more with less animals and healthier animals and give even more consumers what they want. It's really the challenges, I think, we haven't talked a lot about it in this room today, is the consumer. Let's not make false conclusions. We can give them choices, but don't take choices away for those that actually don't have the choice and are looking for food, especially this middle class coming.
Thank you. Mark?
I think it's fair to say that I have a long-standing personal interest in biotechnology, and I've seen this debate from both sides, and I think when it comes to GMOs in particular, we could take some of the poison and some of the divisiveness and some of the bitterness out of the debate if we put a human face on it, both on the practitioners of developing the technology and on the potential beneficiaries. So I want to share with you some recent experiences I've had in Africa and elsewhere which aim to do just this. Here's some potential beneficiaries. This is a family in the eastern coastal district of Tanzania. And if you look closely, you can see that they're cassava crops, which are these plants just there and in the background are failing. And they're failing because of a combination of diseases. Cassava mosaic virus and possibly even more seriously, cassava brown streak virus, which essentially rots the tubers under the ground. And this is the food security crop to end all food security crops. If they lose their cassava, this family goes hungry, and indeed this is what's happening. And I could see, I'm no expert on malnutrition, but I could see when I looked into the eyes of these children, when you look at their physiques, that these are not well fed. The mother and indeed all the other families in the district told me that they are experiencing what we would call food insecurity. They don't have enough to eat. They've only got little bits of cassava which they can salvage from the ones which are rotten. Now, what can we do about this? Well, the only healthy cassava crop that I ever saw, and I traveled in Kenya and Uganda as well as in Tanzania, was here at the research station near Kampala in Uganda, where they've developed in field trials a virus-resistant cassava. Here's one of the practitioners, the agronomist who's developing this crop. There's the healthy one, there's the one which is infected with the virus. Look how green and lush the ones are in the background. Those are the ones which have been genetically transformed to express, actually they don't express, what they have is a tiny sequence of DNA from the virus's coat protein, which enables the plant to recognize the pathogen when it invades and to deal with it. So they don't even express the novel protein. There's nothing different about these plants other than their DNA itself. Now, what's the potential for the farmers that I saw in Tanzania getting hold of this crop? I would say it's not that dissimilar from zero. Why is that? It's not that the crop is owned by a rapacious multinational which is refusing to release it unless you pay millions of dollars into their slush fund. The problem is that there is a climate of fear and misinformation about biotechnology which has led to a regulatory environment in these countries which is essentially prohibitionary. You cannot take this crop outside the research station in Uganda. It's behind a big padlocked fence at the moment without risking years in jail for going against biosafety regulations, which have no scientific basis. So the people in food insecurity are denied the benefits of this technology because of misinformation campaigns. And where are they coming from? The things I was hearing when I was in Uganda. There are radio adverts being run by NGOs telling people that their children will be made sterile if they grow GMOs. One of the MPs who's on the Parliamentary Science Committee in Uganda told me that some of the NGOs had gone to his constituency and told the Muslim constituents that they were putting pig genes in bananas and almost caused a riot which threatened his personal security. Why would they be doing this? Because they are against GMOs in any context. It's not about the commercial imperative. It's not about protecting farmers from being exploited. It's about denying farmers the right to choose what they plant. And there's an idea that all GMOs are necessarily developed in the private sector, that there's something which brings in a sort of colonial aspect to this debate. And in fact, that was most prominent in Zimbabwe, where the government itself, the Mugabe regime, is anti-GMO because they see it as some kind of foreign conspiracy. The agriculture minister in the Mugabe government has said, "Over my dead body will GMOs ever be planted." And here in the university, in the public sector, these young students who are aged 18, 19, have done genetic transformations by themselves. They bring up buckets of water because there's no running water in the lab. These Petri dishes, these jam jars, they have salvaged from the town dump, sterilized them, wrapped cling film around the top, and they're doing BT, by the way. Those of you who know about BT technology, which they've got the Bacillus thuringiensis, they've got it from the soil outside the laboratory. So they're doing all of this from first principles. This is backyard, garage biotech, which is being done, and what they're trying to do is transform also sweet potato in a way which can make it virus resistant, because the productivity of crops in Zimbabwe is also being affected by these new pathogens, which may or may not, by the way, have something to do with climate change. I think there's potentially a link there. And of course, when you look at the poster child of biofortification, golden rice, this plot that was trashed by activists in August last year, who were these people when this was looked into? And it turned out that the group is called Massipag, and the group is funded by the Swedish government. The Swedish International Development Agency, which funds IRI, the International Rice Research Institute, which does golden rice, also funds the group which destroyed the golden rice plot. Now, how does this make any sense? It doesn't make any sense. But there's a kind of dogma here, I think, in some development circles, some areas where low productivity, low input farming is seen as beneficial to farmers. And this makes no sense to me, because people who are experiencing food insecurity because their harvests are so low, why is it beneficial to them to have the oldest varieties of the crops which are least resistant to disease, least resistant to climate change, and keep those people in food insecure situations? And I'm now involved as a visiting fellow of Cornell in launching BT brinjal in Bangladesh. The good news is that about 3 weeks ago, the first seedlings were distributed by the Minister of Agriculture to farmers in several regions in Bangladesh. This is really a milestone, because this is South Asia's first genetically modified food crop, and it's going out from the public sector, from Cornell and from the Bangladesh Agricultural Research Institute, which is also publicly funded, out to the hands of smallholder farmers, and they will be encouraged to save the seed from one year to the next. And why is this important? Because you see this pest here, it's called fruit and shoot borer, destroys, as it is, 50 or 60% of the crop. And brinjal is the most important vegetable crop in Bangladesh, and of course important for Bangladeshi cuisine. Guess how many times brinjal farmers spray their crops to protect against it? And what are they spraying? They're spraying organophosphates, things which are banned in Western countries for very good reasons. Take a guess. How many times are they spraying this crop? Weekly, he says. Exactly. No, daily is the answer. And they're spraying it daily because it's very wet in Bangladesh, and they're growing this during the monsoon season, and it gets washed off every day, so then they have to reapply. And because when this thing lays its eggs, and the eggs drill into the fruit, then you can't get it with an insecticide, so they have to spray it every single day. And what are they wearing? Are they wearing any masks? No, they're doing this in flip-flops because it's hot. They're not wearing any protection. The levels of health impacts from the toxicity of these chemicals is extremely high. So the resistant version, which is resistant to this most severe and threatening pest, should be able to avoid the use of 80 to 90% of the pesticides. So the idea, which is universal in my experience in this debate, that GMO equals more pesticide, is the exact opposite of the truth. The people who are against this in Bangladesh is the environmental lobby and the pesticides companies. Now, how much sense does that make? And here's the final case study. There was one more slide. This was the first use of pathogen-derived resistance. The papaya ring spot virus, which devastated the crop in Hawaii in the mid-1990s, was saved. And you can see here one of the early field trials. That was the resistant crop, and this was the virus-susceptible crop, was saved by the first use of genetic modification in fruit from the 1990s onwards. When this was, I had more slides than I thought, but actually, when this was taken into Thailand, it was stopped by Greenpeace. So Thai farmers were never able to actually use this, despite the fact it was also developed in the public sector. And I did want to show you with you Rothamsted's latest. Has anyone seen this? The omega-3 long-chain fatty acids, which Rothamsted Research, public sector funded again, has got into camelina, which is an important, well, not particularly important, but it's an oilseeds crop. If this can be used as a sustainable source of fish food, then potentially we can begin to take some of the pressure off overfishing and marine biodiversity. So all of these areas, I as an environmentalist am excited about the potential of this technology. I as a humanitarian, I hope, all of you would be excited about the potential for this technology. So how do we get beyond this polarized debate, which is actually removing the choice, removing the agency, removing the power from the farmers in the developing countries to make their own decisions? And that's, I think, the most important point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Frank, I want to ask you, you said that the leaps ahead in technology that we're having at the moment have been led by the private sector, and the public sector is following along behind. Does that have anything to do with the political resistance to agricultural technology? I mean, in the Green Revolution, that was public sector led. Why is the public sector slow this time around?
Complacency. I mean, we thought for a long time we had plenty food and food prices were low, so gradually the investments in agriculture and publicly funded agriculture were dropping, until 2007, 2008, like, oops, maybe this is not such a already solved problem. So food security is back on the agenda, and in the CGIAR, for instance, investments have doubled over the last 5 years. They needed to, they were way behind. So now technologies that indeed were developed in the private sector are indeed getting into the labs. I don't think this had to do, as you suggested, with a fear of GMOs. Actually, our investors are, of course, coming from a whole variety of, from the whole spectrum, those that are strongly in favor and those that are not. So this is a very useful debate to have. I think it would be very helpful. Here we are equating biotechnology with transformations. We don't see it like that. We are very, very strong fans of biotechnology, and we see that, if you like, genetics, genomics, a whole series of biotechnologies are crucially important. We couldn't do almost any ag research without them. Very few of them lead to transformations. Some 10 years ago, if you asked rice scientists, how can we overcome these challenges? Most of the things they thought would have to come through transformations, getting some trait or some resistance from another organism into a plant and creating a transformation. As we are learning so much more about the varieties that we have in our own gene banks, we're finding a lot of the necessary traits sit in our own rice gene bank, for instance, and are coming into, so one after the other, we're achieving stuff through classic breeding, sped up by biotechnology. So I think that's a massive increased awareness we could have, that biotechnology in many cases does not lead to GMOs.
Can I open it to the floor? Do we have any questions out there? There's one over here. If we could get a mic down here, please.
I don't know if I should stand. I thank the panel members. Now, my question is on getting the BT, for example, the technologies to the population. We have seen a lot of resistance from especially NGOs. Some are local, but the majority are from outside. They are from the West. I would like to hear what you have to say about this. The West is using more of the innovations than us in Africa.
Shall I go on to that?
No, that would be great.
I think there's a challenge to the whole NGO sector to engage in an honest, evidence-based debate on this. I've lost count of the numbers of times I came up against. To call it misinformation would be to be too kind. I mean, I was in Ghana looking at the BT cowpea project, which is similar to BT brinjal, cowpea being an important leguminous crop in northern Ghana in particular. And the farmers who we sat down with said, oh, we won't be able to use this because it has a terminator gene in it, which is itself, of course, not true. Terminator meaning that it'll terminate us. They thought it was actually going to kill them. Where do they get this messaging from? It comes from NGOs, which are, as you say, accessing sources from Western European funding, which is non-transparent, by the way. If you ask them about it, they don't want to. They close up. I was in Tanzania and doing a talk with Tanzanian scientists, and some farmers stood up who had been trained organically. They said they were organic farmers, and they were speaking in Swahili, so I didn't even understand this at the outset, but they said they wouldn't use GMOs because it would make their children gay, homosexual. And again, I don't think these kinds of myths come from nowhere. I don't think they arise spontaneously, but it's very interesting that they're culturally specific, so they exploit the things that people are most scared of. A bit like the anti-vaccination myths in Nigeria, for example, on the polio vaccine, which exploited Muslim sort of phobias about sterility and things like this. But the fact that Western NGOs, who would claim to be science-based and evidence-based in every other area, would be involved or even complicit in this kinds of misinformation, I think is extraordinary. And I don't think that their funding bases in countries like this have any idea what's going on. And so the challenge really is to engage with them behind the scenes and to say, look, you do realize this is damaging people's lives and damaging their prospects and their food security, and also to expose in public and say you've got to be accountable for what you're doing.
Frank.
The positive side here is that quite a large number of African governments are doing a lot of research on GM crops. The outstanding one is Uganda. Those field trials that Mark showed just of cassava, they've got 6 different crops with, I think, nearly a dozen transformations in field trials in Uganda. And I usually say that Uganda is ahead of the United Kingdom in terms of its research in GM. And we know of field trials going on now in Ghana, Nigeria, in Kenya, in Uganda, in Mozambique, and so on. I mean, it's about Burkina Faso. There's that number of countries in Africa who are pursuing that research. And I think we're close to a situation where some of them will actually be commercialized out there. I hope so. I think the other big player in this is China. China's got 30, 40 different genetically modified crops available, particularly, of course, rice. And they're nervous at the moment about releasing them. But I think it's going to change, and I think they will get released, and then that'll set off a whole chain effect of releases of GM crops.
Frank, you want to come in on this?
Yes, as Mark points out, there's a lot of very unsophisticated debate going on here. In the end, of course, these are government decisions on whether governments want to allow these crops or not. And what some of us can do, including us in research, is not only using these technologies in our labs, but also help build capacity. One of our institutes is the Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, in Washington, that works with governments to develop food policy ability, capacity. And I think the African Union itself, your own department, could help sponsor, I think, an increased capacity of governments to have a science-based debate about these issues, so that indeed countries have the capacity to come up with informed decisions rather than have the debates as they are going on now. And that, I think, can be a role that research can play, but is a very large part in governments as well.
Jeff, do you want to come in on this?
You know, I think in the meat side, just real quickly, global trade standards have helped allow smaller countries that can't necessarily maybe afford to do the research to understand scientifically what's safe. And then, you know, I know there was a significant, couple meetings here over the last couple of years with FAO and Codex where 3-4 continents are starting to vote more, give us the opportunity to say no. And that's opened things up pretty significantly.
Can I ask you, Jeff? I'm fascinated by the fact that we're losing an egg, a hen a day. No, an egg a day. No,
Egg
losing
a year.
It's not a day. You're losing.
That could affect English breakfast if you did that, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But why?
It's really 3 things, three drivers. One is disease is still there. I mean, there's still challenges. I mean, if you look at Mexico, you know, they have a situation where bird flu wipes out over half of the eggs in Mexico last year. You've got, second is just the lack of willingness to innovate in this space if the predictability is not there. So there's maybe innovation is a lot more prone right now in dairy because there's more opportunity there versus layers. And then I think the third is, there are policies that can impact the way the animal's raised to enabling the practices around the world to be able to optimize that bird. Okay.
We've got a question over there.
Yeah, My name is Ramajita Tabu from the Forum of Agricultural Research in Africa. Gordon has shown some promising technologies, innovations, and I think the rest of the panel members have done the same. But I think the problem that we're facing, the challenge is how do you go really to wider scale? And some of the suggestion is that there should be some access to credit, access to inputs, so that the smallholders can be able to buy the seeds and fertilizers. Who should do that? Who should be promoting those kind of measures, accompanying measures that the farmers need to go through? So I would like to hear from the panel members, what's the best way of doing it? Public sector, private sector, the combination of the two? Or what is the most effective way of doing it?
I think that might be over to you, Gordon.
Well, yeah, we've just been talking about technology because that's what we're supposed to talk about. But you're absolutely right. The technology needs to have an enabling environment, which is the good phrase there. So a farmer needs to be able to go and buy seed, good seed, certified seed. So, in other words, it does what it says on the packet. That's the first thing. And you need little companies that are producing these seed, and there are many of them coming up in Africa now. And you need agro-dealers, little mom and pop stores, as the Americans call them, where you can go in the village and buy the seed you want. And you can also buy the fertilizer you want. And some of them, and the fertilizer will be made by a local fertilizer company that's making exactly the right kind of fertilizer for that particular area. And then often through these you can get a credit, maybe from one of the big banks in Africa, and that comes into you too. And you can get advice from some of these little shops too. So you need that link to input markets to make sure that the technologies get to the farmers and that they get the right kind of technology for their area. And I think we need to spend a lot of effort on making sure that that happens.
I would just make a comment. I mean, no question, for us to succeed globalizing innovation, we've got to become more local. And I think partnerships with universities as well as local companies, an example for us is moving into Africa. A lot of our innovation is now delivery device. Now a dairy is only 2 cows, not 2,000 cows. So how do you create a technology that can be delivered in something that's affordable per cow, that can be picked up daily when they're dropping the milk off? The only way we can do that and get it distributed correctly is, smaller quantities has got to be done by local companies. And so I think that's something we've not done well as multinationals is kind of what I kind of say glocalizing, taking our global capabilities and innovation and going local.
Please thank this fairly optimistic panel, and we'll move on to our next.